First of all, I want to thank you for asking me to do this. I'm more than happy to come and talk about fire and archaeology. It's a very important topic, especially these days. And I think it's really important for people to understand what kind of responses we actually do have when it comes to wildfire and what these archaeologists, these highly trained archaeologists, are doing. So every time you see those big major plumes of fire, or hear about a major fire on the news, you can pretty much be rest assured or be assured that there are archaeologists on that fire, helping to do what they can to protect um, archaeological resources. So I'm just going to get right into it. And yes, please do ask questions. I will try to limit the amount of agency speak, but it's kind of second nature to me. So please hit me up if I say something that you don't understand. When it comes to wildfire and archaeology, you need to understand a key thing, especially where I live here in Region 3, which is the Southwest. So for those of you who don't know, I'm coming to you from Williams, Arizona, which is just west of Flagstaff and south of the Grand Canyon. And what we know to be true, as you know, you've seen all these wildfires are all over the news, and you're probably experiencing them in your local area, certainly there in the Great Basin. One of the major causes of the wildfire, and I'm not going to get into global warming, that's not where I'm going at all. One of the major issues with wildfire is you need to understand that fire is in fact part of our natural ecosystems. Our most forests and grasslands have always had fires. Fires have been started either by lightning, natural causes, or, and I won't get into this, but some are probably fairly aware that even tribal people use fire as a way to manipulate the landscape. So we know that fire was a natural part of our landscapes. We also know that most of our prehistoric sites that are out there have been burned over many times. And that is just the way it is when it comes to the ecology for most of the Southwest or Western area. What the difference is now is the severity of these wildfires. These wildfires are hotter, bigger than they've ever been, and part of that, in part, is due to the fact that there's been this massive fuel loading on these forests, in these grasslands, because of the fact that we retarded the natural fire intervals. So when I talk about fire and archaeology, I'm going to be talking about the fact that, you know, we're seeing sites that have probably been burned over many times, but they're getting damaged. Part of the reason why they're getting damaged so much now is due to the severity, the high heat severity of these major wildfires. So that, to set the stage, I'm going to show you an example. As I said, I'm in Williams, Arizona. I just love this. To give you an example to show you how the landscape has changed, and part of the reason what retarding a fire has done is it's increased our the amount of fuel and the amount of trees that are out there. Our forests are at the point now where most of them are naturally dense because of the fact that we retarded wildfire. So this is an excellent example. So this is Williams, for those of you who've never been there, the Grand Canyon Railroad, all that. And this is where I am currently standing. This is a photo from the 1890s, and let me show you this fade.
Margaret?
Yes.
There's a little line across the bottom that says share or hide.
Yeah, do you want me to move that? Oh, hide. Thank you.
Just push the hide.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect. Got it. So I'm gonna back that up and show you the fade again, because it's pretty dramatic. So as you can see, as of 2011, we've got trees major, and this is the ponderosa pine forest here, one of the biggest contiguous ponderosa pine forests in the nation. There are trees in places there were not in 1890s. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that they had already started logging this area in the 1890s. But still, we're seeing trees and grasslands in places that historically they never were. And then part of that is because of all that has been done to basically suppress fire and other activities, which would have normally kept them into check. But now we're at the point where we have unnaturally dense forests. So when you're talking about wildfire, I know this kind of sounds silly, but what exactly is wildfire? In agency speak, uh, there are a couple things that are considered wildfire. One is something that's caused by human beings, and I'm sure I don't need to explain that. The other one is a natural ignition. Here in Arizona, especially, it come July, we have the monsoons that kick in, and that is usually a time when we have most of our biggest wildfires, and that is because of lightning. So lightning strikes are considered natural ignitions. And I'll get into what managed fire actually is, but we take advantage of that here in Arizona and the Southwest to actually allow fire to do its natural role on the landscape and actually will manage them. And this is a new thing, probably in the last 15, 20 years that we started doing out here. But they're essentially considered to be wildfires. But we actually will allow it up to a point to do what it naturally would do. Now, we don't do this with human caused fires. This is only done with natural ignitions. Prescribed burns, on the other hand, which people are probably aware of, as far as agencies are concerned, they're not considered wildfire and I say that with quotes, wildfire in the sense that of a human wildfire, human ignited. And part of that is because these are things that we actually do about an environmental evaluation. We do a full NEPA, what they call National Environmental Policy Act evaluation is done prior to this. We do all consultation with the SHPOs, with the tribes, and plan for these. And they are planned, we light them, and it's a planned ignition, as they state. However, and I'm be the first one to tell you, occasionally these do get out of hand. And in those cases, they'll go from being a prescribed burn, i.e. a controlled fire, to an actual wildfire when we actually lose control of it. We had one happen here on the Kaibab a few years ago, and it does happen. I'm not going to lie. But in terms of agency parlance, that is the difference. So you got a wildfire. What do you do? Main thing is if an agency spots a wildfire on its land or private land or however, whoever is responsible for the fire response at that point will dispatch fire crews to go find it and figure out what the situation is. So for the most part, they'll dispatch local resources. They'll take a look at the fire where it's burning, and they'll look at the values at risk. And if it's especially in the last couple of weeks here in Arizona, if it's windy like crazy, we're getting 40-mile-an-hour winds. The likelihood of a local crew being able to handle that and catch it is pretty low. So when they come out, one of the first things they do is assess the situation, assess the fire, assess the values that might be at risk by a major wildfire. So we're talking infrastructure, communities, properties. Then they determine the level of response needed. If it's a fire that's moving really fast and there's no way they're going to catch it, or they don't feel that they have the resources adequate enough to address it well enough, then the local land managing agency will actually order, through a system called IROC, they will in fact order an incident management team. These are highly skilled people who come in. It's a preset team. They all have and each individual has different roles as part of the major team coming in. There's 4 types of teams. A type 4 team is your local team, i.e. your local folks from your local fire organization, all the way up to a type 1 team. These are the teams who manage the major fires that they know this when you got structures burning or major communities at risk. It's a type 1 team they're bringing in to manage that. And then when you have wildfires that go half a statewide, that's when you're bringing in there's even a higher level management team that comes in, who in that case they're actually bringing in multiple incident management teams who will actually manage portions of the fire, and then they have an overarching management team which looks over the individual management team. So it's quite an organization. Bottom line is, once the management team comes in, that's who, it's either the management team or the local agency who actually will actually make the order in for an archaeologist. And you got a team rolling, you're going to have archaeologists rolling as well. So this is an example. Yeah, the cat's cute. We all know the cat's cute, but I want to look at the screen behind it. And that's an example of what the critical values are. And that's the agency who determines what the critical values are that are at risk from, could potentially risk from a wildfire in a certain area. And they're the ones, because they're the locals, they know what their values are. They'll put together a list of values. And when the incident management team comes in, it's the agency who hands that to the team and says, these are what our major concerns are. The team then basically takes command of the whole fire and the whole situation, and they work for the agency. So the agency is the one who basically directs them on what they need to do. So in which case, when the archaeologists come in, they actually work for the incident management team, but they're also coordinating directly with the agency archaeologists as well. So you're bringing in archaeologists. Key thing to understand when it comes to archaeologists and archaeologists who work for wildfire, this is not your normal Section 106 process. This is not your normal evaluation process. This is an emergency situation. So our normal approach to addressing effects to cultural resources goes out the window for the most part, simply because it's an evolving situation and you have to basically triage it. So, but there are some key things that they do and try to achieve throughout the entire incident. So legally, for those of you who are legal eagles, yeah, this actually falls under the advisory council, the historic ACHP, Arizona Historic Council, the Historic Preservation no, I can't think of it. My brain is not going there. Anyway, the point is, the 800 regs, it is 800.12 is the emergency situation, which we actually operate under. So advisory council on historic preservation, that's what I couldn't come up with. Anyway, point is, that doesn't mean that the agency can just go in and do whatever they want. That is not the case. But in fact, the law basically states that we do have to notify the SHPO's office, the advisory, depending on the size of the fire, also the advisory council's office, and also tribes, depending on and especially if there's been an emergency declared. Not all agency people are aware of this, but that is essentially what is supposed to happen. So the role of the wildfire archaeologist, bottom line, and I'm sure this is pretty straightforward. You come in, one of the biggest things you need to do is identify and protect any cultural resources from fire. So then you provide input into the incident management team. So once you've identified resources that are at risk, you'll put input to the management team, try to advise them on how they can actually implement their management actions on the fire and still try to protect cultural resources when possible. It's not always possible to do it, but you need specialists on hand who can help them figure out how to meet their goals, but at the same time protect resources. So that's where working with the fire crews is critical. And these archaeologists are in fact firefighters. I mean, they're trained firefighters. They meet the qualification of firefighters, but they're also archaeologists. So they actually have the same qualifications as a firefighter on a fire crew. So they have the ability to actually work directly on a fire line. And oftentimes they will be nested in working in a division or a series of crews on one section of a fire. So you may have one archaeologist who will come in, will work with the division, which again is of multiple crews, and they'll be there to not only work with the crews, identify resources, help them avoid stuff, work with heavy equipment operators and anything else in that area. So they are literally on the fire line. And the other thing that fire archaeologists do is help with the post-fire assessments, which I'll get into what that exactly entails. So one of the first things that's, and it's really critical, especially for land managers, is you gotta have really good maps and GIS coverages. You got crews, you got archaeologists who are coming in or literally being ordered in from across the country, who may or may not know the archaeological resources of that area. They are trained archaeologists. They can recognize archaeological resources, but they don't necessarily, not with that agency or from that forest or from that BLM land. So it's really critical when they first arrive is they have to tie in with the local archaeologist and get as much information, particularly GIS information, maps, site records, anything else that they can use to identify any known resources within the fire area. So that is one of the first things that they have to do is get that information. Once they get that information, they actually get on the ground and try to find those places that have been pre-identified. Primarily so that, and then mark them, in this case with pink flagging, mark them in such a way that the fire crews who work in that area know that they're there. Yeah, they've got to know they're there to protect them. And then communicate what these are, what the flagging means or what color you use. Usually they'll decide a specific color that everybody will use. So every fire crew knows if they see that color, that's an archaeological site that they have to act accordingly. So they'll get out, they'll try to identify them, they'll try and mark them so that fire crews know that they're in the area and can make sure to avoid when possible. And in this case, try to actually also, by identifying, it helps you to advise them to minimize impact. So in this case, and I didn't take this photo, but by the looks of it, those are hewn logs. Most likely, I'd be willing to bet those are railroad ties, and they're actually directing heavy equipment around them to minimize effects. And I have to say, flat out, one of the biggest effects on wildfire is not the fire, it is the response to the fire. So heavy equipment and working with heavy equipment is a big part of the modus operandi. So if in some ways that is one of the biggest threats to these cultural resources. So working with heavy equipment operators, identifying these sites ahead of time when you can, so you can walk them around or minimize their impact onto. And notice, let's see, are those, I guess those are metal tracked. Oftentimes they'll have rubber tracked, they'll bring in rubber tracked equipment because it doesn't dig in as much, to try and minimize effects to cultural resources and other resources that could be affected by that. So again, try to figure out ways to minimize impacts to known sites. And then the other thing that they do, and this is where the fire line qualifications are critical, they get on the ground and literally walk areas. And in this case, oftentimes we'll have archaeologists who are out with dozer operators. But especially in these major fires, oftentimes there's way more dozers and heavy equipment than there are archaeologists. So you have to kind of triage it. You have to figure out where the high priorities are, and that's where having pre-knowledge and having your GIS information and your site records are really critical, because then you have an idea of where you're going to see some high site densities or low site densities, or where you're going to have critical fire sensitive sites. But they do get on the ground, they work with the fire crews, they work with the dozer operators, they come in and assess effects by the activities that are going on to actually address the impacts of the fire. So how do we protect resources? Any way we can. But the main one is using the least damage possible. So you use whatever you use. There's a lot of ways to do it, but some of these ways do in fact have effects on cultural resources and their integrity. But the question is, you have minor effect versus losing the entire site. So you have to balance those. Those are judgment calls, and you have to balance that. So the main thing is to try, there are a lot of different tools that we can use, but you try to use the one that's going to protect the site, but also has the least amount of potential to affect the site. So in that case, for instance, fire trestles will actually bring in fire shelters to to full on cover sites. Is this foolproof? No. And Lynn Gassaway, who is the super fire archaeologist, she was on a fire. Said they had several. This fire, in fact, they had several of these trestles, and that they had wrapped, and one of them got a spark in it, and they lost it. So this is not foolproof, but it can help protect these really, and especially these trestles, these fire sensitive sites that where the wood's been exposed for 100 years. So it's very dry, very flammable. And also notice that there are pieces of this trestle that are outside of what's wrapped. So they're fully aware that they're going to lose some pieces of this, but that's the choices you have to make. Other things, fire retardant, foams, gels. There's been studies about the effects of fire retardant on wood elements and sites. There is some concerns. I don't know where people sit on that. I don't know where the studies sit on that, but there has been studies about this issue. We do know that foam and gels are a real concern around water sources. So there are areas where we just can't use it. It's just not a tool due to other issues, resource issues. But when it's available and it's safe to use, it can be very effective. Sprinklers, hoses, black and wet lines. Sprinkler and hoses, that actually is something that they will do. They will bring on full-in sprinkler systems and wet down, as in this case, a bridge or a cabin, as a way to make them less susceptible to sparks that are coming in from the fire. So you can either set up a sprinkler system or have crews will stand there and literally wet them down and soak them. Does the water have an effect on these? Probably, but it's better than losing it completely. Black lining, wet lining is literally putting a wet line or using foam and gel around a site. Black lining is as that photo down in the corner there, left-hand corner where the bedrock mortars are. Literally, you bring in a torch and you burn off the fuel around the site. And this is very effective because what you're simply doing is you're getting rid of any fuel that would carry fire to the site. And bedrock mortars, for the most part, are not that site fire sensitive unless it's a really hot fire. If it's a really high severity hot fire, if it sits in there, and especially if there's fuel sitting on top of that bedrock mortar to allow fire to smolder there, it will destroy that rock to the point where it'll heat up and spall and really do a major damage to that feature. So doing something like black lining, burning off any fuel, taking a broom and brushing off any fuel anything that's built up on top of these, and even especially if you've been in California, you know how that can be. That helps to protect them. The other key thing is you got to be innovative. Fires are very dynamic. And also, you're dealing with a lot of people with a variety of different knowledge and expertise. So be flexible. Be willing to do things like bring in pads to put heavy equipment on to drive over sites on roads. Be willing to talk to some of the fire crews. And if you have an issue, come in and say, hey, this is what our issue is. Do you have any solutions? Work with them. And work with your other fire archaeologists. And the key thing is fire archaeologists, these folks, we all come in from across the country and have a variety of different kinds of expertise and knowledge and background and personalities. And oftentimes a lot of firefighters are very much type A personalities. So you have to be able to work with the crew. You have to understand that you've got a variety of different perspectives and a lot of brain power, and you need to take advantage of that and be flexible enough to be able to look at different ways to approach a problem, especially because fires are dynamic and constantly changing. And in some cases, you are literally running out in front of it to try and protect things before the fire arrives. So be prepared to be flexible because the fires, it changes. The management actions will change based on the changes in the fire. So the fire team may have thought that the fire was going to do one thing, and if it has a major run, say burns up 3,000 acres in about 20 minutes in a way that they were not expecting, that'll change their entire focus in terms of their goals and what they're trying to achieve, and they'll move crews, etc. You need to be prepared for that and be willing and be flexible. Key thing though is for fire archaeologists is working on a fire line is not safe. At all. It's not only the fire that is not safe, but especially we have a tendency to work around a lot of heavy equipment. So you need to know when it's safe to work and when it's not safe to work. The bottom line is human safety, firefighter and human safety is the top priority. Cultural resources, it affects the cultural resources, will not take precedent. So you may lose sites, and you may get sites damaged because it's just simply not safe to get in there. But you can go back through later on and assess the damage at a later date. So, and heavy equipment is more and more fires are bringing in heavy equipment. These fires are dynamic, they're big, the crews it's unsafe. So more and more teams are choosing to bring in a lot of heavy equipment to work these fires. It means less exposure to fire crews, including archaeologists, and able to get a lot more work done at a shorter rate of time. So that also means you got more heavy equipment that could potentially be a threat to archaeological resources. So that is something that's another thing you just simply have to balance. So when archaeologists do get on the ground and do your typical archaeological inventory survey, when again it is safe to do so. So usually if you can be out there when the dozer operators are on the ground, that's actually optimal, because if you know of a resource that they're about to hit, if you're out in front of them and identified them, you can walk the dozer around it. You can find ways to avoid it. If it's safe to do so. But oftentimes, because there's more heavy equipment than there are archaeologists, oftentimes we're coming in behind them and actually walking these lines after they've actually put them in. Now, especially in California, where they have a lot of hand crews, some of this could be dozer activity. Sometimes hand crews are the ones who are actually doing those big major lines. That too can have an effect. So, again, oftentimes the archaeologists are coming in afterwards. We get information from the incident management team who gives us maps, lets us know where these lines are. And then usually the fire archaeologists will strategize where to put other resources immediately, and then come back in when it's less dangerous to survey these at a later time. So what do you find? All sorts of things. Dozer lines will expose sites you aren't aware you can have no surface expression from. Some cases they'll go through sites that you do have surface expression from. And this here you've got, looks to me like it's either a roasting pit there, or it could be a pit house. I'm not sure the scale. And on the left you can see where they've exposed a bedrock mortar. They literally drove right through it. This is where having documentation is really critical, because once they've gotten on and they've identified a site that's been impacted, if it's been previously recorded and you have the site records in hand, you can modify the site records. The main thing is to take a look at what was recorded and then make sure you capture the types of damage that was done to the site. Later on, as after the fire is done, the agency archaeologist gets all this documentation, and then they can take a look at and ask questions about whether or not these sites have been so damaged that they no longer have enough integrity to be considered eligible for the National Register, and those types of evaluative type questions that'll need to be addressed after the fire is done. But it's the fire archaeologists, if they have the documentation, they add to the existing documentation. If these are newly discovered sites, they will record them. They don't record them in depth, but they do record enough information to be able to A, know where it is, B, get enough characterization to know what kind of site it is. And they'll probably talk about the kinds of damage, what's been damaged and how much integrity is left on it, that type of stuff. And again, that's information plus any photographs and any GIS, GPS data that's been collected. All of that gets bundled up and then handed over to the agency archaeologist at the end of the fire. There's a lot of guidance being developed in recent years about fire and how to assess archaeological site damage. Something to consider, because there's damage to a site. Most sites are damaged by fire. The biggest question is especially in the realm of National Historic Preservation Act and the 36 CFR 800 regs, the question is are these fires so damaged that they no longer contain any scientific information, or can no longer be eligible for listing on the National Register? And then so a lot of times nobody knew. It was a lot of guesswork around this. But in recent years, there has been guidance that has been developed. I won't go too much into it, but this is one of them. This came in 2013. There was a one named Krista Deal who was doing a lot of work around this, and you'll see a lot of professional papers that were published by her. She did a lot of experimental archaeology around this topic. And so unfortunately she passed a few years ago, but her work is just critical to some of this stuff. So you can see there's how obsidian is affected. There's been studies about how that affects obsidian hydration rates. Bear in mind, as I said, most prehistoric sites have been burned over multiple times, so there's a lot of question about this. Also, they did experiments to figure out how much soil is damaged. And again, it comes down to how intense the fire heat has a direct effect. We do know the first few centimeters of anything that's buried in a site is likely to be heated up. And we know this by looking at prehistoric sites that have, especially the surface. You'll see sites on the surface in an area that hasn't been burned in many years that appear, the sites, the flakes will be popped and it'll look like they've been burned, because they probably have. So we know that soils do get changed and color within the first few feet. But for sites that are deep, that have really long, deep depth in their cultural integrity, most likely anything below the first top 10 centimeters or so is still going to be pretty intact and not affected. Other thing to keep in mind is here, in historic sites, it's been burned through, but there's still a lot of information here. And I can tell you from looking at this photo, I wasn't on this site, but I can tell you from looking at this photo, the fire that went through here was not high heat and high heat intensity. And the reason why I know that is because those hole and cap and cans that are in that dump, and don't get me into, I'm a historic archaeologist, I love dumps. But a hole and cap can, those are actually closed with solder. And a high heat fire, that solder would have melted. Also, that glass would have melted. So I can tell you it was just a light fire. You can see there's still a lot of information. There's still a lot of integrity in terms of at least the cultural material that's in that. The other thing they do is they do damage assessments. So in this case, it looks like that they used this as a staging area. Stage on top of a site. It was not surprising. Anything that was cool a couple thousand years ago is probably a pretty great place to hang out now. So we try to avoid this, but occasionally they've gone ahead and used it as a staging area before the archaeologists even get into the area. So in which case they will go back through and do damage assessments to figure out what level of effect there actually has been. Again, they'll do the assessment, they'll document it, and all this information gets handed over to the agency archaeologist. The other thing that they do is the post-fire containment repair. And I make that specific statement because what people don't always realize is fires don't get put out. Fire teams do not put fires out. They contain them. The difference being is a fire, an actual wildfire, could actually smolder and burn for months internally. But what they call a fire contained is when they've literally walked the entire fire perimeter. This is the firefighters will walk the fire perimeter, and they will assess, they will look at, and what they call cold trail, literally with their hands, will test the heat of it with about 3 chains in from the boundary of the fire to see where the hot spots are, and they'll put them out. So you'll have to use hoses. If you got trees that are burning and smoldering, they'll wet those down, they'll put that out. When they've taken a section and they've actually cold trailed it and have determined and done infrared, not seeing any heat, that's when they'll call that section contained. So when you get these reports out saying that, 20% of the fire is considered contained, it's because they've only done 20% of this cold trailing. I can tell you for sure that a good chunk of that, they're at the point of saying on 20%, probably about 30% of the fire is actually technically contained, but until they've actually walked the boundary and done this cold trailing, they don't publicly announce that. So they only publicly announce what the portion is contained. So when they've got a fire out, it's literally contained, meaning they've done the whole containment piece on that end. So, and then they bring in crews to basically keep an eye on it to make sure it doesn't come out of that containment area. So when you start seeing containment on fires or you announce, that's when they start doing this repair work. Utilities will come in and do and replace their power poles. That's when they have what they call the BEAR assessment. That's the Bird Area Emergency Response Assessment. These are a crew of hydrologists that also will bring in an archaeologist who go out and look at what kind of soil damage has been done, a potential for flooding. And then there's post-fire salvage timber sales is something the Forest Service does as a way to recoup and it's a way to bring in and take down some marketable timber that could potentially be become fuel in the future, as well as other fire restoration. So these are things the fire archaeologists help with. And then any recommendations that come out of BEAR or fire restoration recommendations are often handed off to the agency, who are then responsible for implementing those recommendations. So yeah, I mean, here's the reality. We do lose sites. There are losses. No question about it. But also these activities do allow for a lot of wins. So oftentimes a lot of these management actions are focused in on fire sensitive sites, really high value sites. But and sometimes, depending on what the management action is, sometimes that work. As I said, Lynn's situation where they literally covered a trestle and they got one spark in, sometimes it doesn't. But there's no question about the fact that when it does work, it works well. And even in some cases, like something like a cabin, they may have taken a management action, but the cabin may still get some damage, but it may not be completely destroyed because of those management actions. So, either way you look at it, the best the fire archaeologists do the best they can with the tools that they have. Post-fire finds, yeah, you get away, you clear all that fuel, you're going to find a lot. No question about it. So that is very common to find archaeological sites that the agency may have walked through that area before. They were not able to see, but once the fuel goes away, that opens it up to discovery and new things. That also means it opens up to pot hunters who want to come in and look for it because they know this. So it becomes a management and fire becomes a law enforcement issue, because now with these fires, these sites are wide open and vulnerable to looting. The nice other part about being a fire archaeologist is you're working with crews of our firefighters who are coming in from across the country, and making firefighters aware of the value of cultural resources is really critical. Because if they value it, and then they're more likely to help do things to protect them. Here on the Kaibab, when I was the fire archaeologist on the Kaibab, our fire crews took great pride in protecting archaeological resources, and got to the point where they actually recognized we have a lot of Navajo uh, pinion nut collecting camps on the Kaibab, because we abut Navajo. So when I was in the Kaibab, especially up near the Grand Canyon, the crews up there got to the point where they actually recognized these sites, and before we even got up there, would take management actions on them, putting in either a black line or putting a hard line around it to protect it and flag them and let us know that they're there. So, I mean, they got to the point where they recognized and knew what to do, and then would help us to be able to protect those places. So getting the firefighters involved in this and helps really to be more successful. The other part of fire archaeologists, is working with tribes. It's critical. A lot of these resources that we're protecting in fire are places that are important to tribes. So there's not only archaeological resources, there's traditional collecting areas that are important to tribes. There's sacred sites that are important to tribes that are being affected by these fires. But there's also communities who abut agency lands that are threatened by fires, and then elder folks who are being impacted by heavy smoke. So the tribal communities are impacted on a variety of different levels when it comes to wildfire. So it's really critical to work with any tribal communities in the area. Usually this is done by the agency, not the incident management team. However, the incident management team is oftentimes asked to be made available to go in and talk to tribal leaders. And many tribal people work fires. BIA has fire crews that they manage. Here in the Southwest, we use a lot of tribal crews on our who come in and work with incident management teams. So a lot of the tribal people actually have fire training. And in some cases, we have red card tribal members who will come in and actually kind of nest with the fire archaeology team and work with them directly. Or when it's safe, we'll bring in elders to go see damaged sites or that type of stuff. But it's generally the agency is the go-between for this, and the agency will work with the incident management team to be able to provide information to tribal members. All right, so let me wind a couple more slides here. One of the key things I want to impart on you is, wildfire is an emergency situation, but as a land managing agency like the Forest Service or BLM or any of us, we're not victims to wildfires. There are a lot of things that we as archaeologists, land managing agency archaeologists, can be doing to be prepared for fire, and so there are things that we can do before a wildfire hits. So one of the biggest and critical ones is update your maps and your GIS coverages. If when you get these crews coming in, these fire archaeologists coming in, it's critical for them to have accurate information. They can't protect sites if they don't know where they are, or the information around their location is bad. For them to be able to do good management protection on these things, they've got to have good information. So having updated maps and GIS coverages is critical, and make them available. It never hurts to kind of download and put on the thumb drive shape files. So if you have a fire and an incident management team comes on, you can literally hand that over to the archaeologist and say, here, this is the information you need. And we'll work with you to pull site records so you have the additional information. Having that GIS information is critical. So you can prepare that in advance to be able to hand to the archaeologist when they come onto the land. Identifying fire sensitive sites. Make sure you know what they are ahead of time. If you have any critical ones like trestles and bridges and those types of things, identify them ahead of time. And if you can, during off season, do management actions on them. Do things to reduce fuel around them. Burn off of them if you got a prescribed burn in the area. Do activities to try and reduce fuel onto those sites. It'll make it a lot easier for a wildfire team to be able to protect them if you've taken this steps ahead of time. Talk to tribes ahead of time. Find out what the resources are that they're most concerned with and how they want to be communicated with in the event of a fire. And on the Kaibab, the tribes that we worked with really weren't too concerned unless it involved a traditional cultural property or known sacred site. Then they wanted to call. But other than that, for the most part, they're like, talk to us afterwards. Ensure archaeologists on the fire and the agency archaeologists know something about fire. It's amazing to me how many agency archaeologists absolutely have not taken the time to learn anything about the fire system and incident management teams and how that works. It's critical for them to understand that so they know when to insert themselves or how they can support it. And better yet, get your archaeologists trained. Even if they don't go out on wildfires, it never hurts for them to have basic firefighter training and get certified as a fire arc. At least they can always do it on their own lands, or at least they know what's involved and be able to be better support to those teams that do come in. And then really ultimately prepare a guide on how to actually protect cultural resources within your lands that you manage. You can provide all sorts of good background information all in one easy identifiable document that when the team comes onto your land, you can literally hand them and say, this is what our expectations for you to do. On the Kaibab, I did one in 2010. It was something to give to the archaeologists when they came on the forest, but our fire teams actually included it in their fire management program document for the entire forest. So it became part of the forest fire management document. So that they could, in fact, provide that information if we, the archaeologists of the Kaibab, were not available. So, as I said, pre-plan GIS databases. Forest Service actually has what they call a natural resources management system, which is a tabular / GIS system that we now just come in line the last couple of years. We use that to manage all of our archaeological data. We actually have a box in there that says, is this site considered to be fire sensitive? And so we can pre-identify that and literally go through our system and pull all that out for if an archaeologist need it for an incident, so that we can have that handy and available and let them know. Get involved in opportunities to learn more about fire. These are just a few that we have going right now. These were started basically as kind of grassroots organizations just a few years ago, and there's been such a need that they've grown to the point where we have monthly calls. We have and that is not Cloud Vault. It used to be Cloud Vault. Actually, it's a Google Drive now. I just realized that this information is a little out of date. It's a Google Drive where we have a lot of that reference information, those articles by Krista Deal, and some of these other studies that have been done in there. Now, READ cohort, I didn't talk about READ, but READ means Resource Advisor. These are folks who basically have a variety of different backgrounds and resources. So they could be biologists, hydrologists, range people, entomologists, soil scientists, and those folks are brought out to work with the incident management team. Fire archaeologists are a subset of that. So we're specialists in archaeology, but a lot of us are in fact trained as reads as well. So both those monthly calls and both those information has those databases that have those papers and information all contain all sorts of great information about fire. Some specific to archaeology, some specific to larger resources areas. There's a website that is maintained by Lynn Gassaway, started it and maintained it. A lot of that information that's in the fire cohort is actually on that website. Plus, there's a fire archaeology Facebook page for those of you who are social media, as well as a READ Wildfire Read Facebook page. A lot of great information gets posted there. This, in the last 2-3 years, we've actually developed fire archaeology classes. Lynn Gassaway, as I said, she's super fire archaeologist. She's the one with a cadre of folks who actually developed it. This is not an official fire class. The official fire organization has not recognized it. We didn't care. We put it together and have been putting it on anyway. The official fire organizations are beginning to recognize that there's a need for this, and I think they will eventually adopt these classes as part of the overall fire system. But for right now, it's basically a grassroots organization that's been doing this, and we've successfully been putting it on over the last, I think, 3 or 4 years. And as I talked about guides on how to protect, this is one that I think Lynn put together for the Lassen National Forest. I have one for the Kaibab. These are available on the Fire Archaeology website, worth taking a look at. There's a lot of great information in these. They're available for anybody who wants them. There's nothing confidential in any of these. And it's a great guideline. And if anybody has an interest, I say borrow one of these and modify it for your resource area. No point in reinventing the wheel. Finally, I just want to finish up by pointing out that a lot of people assume that agencies like ours, that there's no role in fire for organizations such as the State Historic Preservation Office or the Advisory Council, or tribes for that matter. There are roles for those main agencies as well as tribes, and particularly in developing either programmatic agreements or protocols for things like efficiencies in fuels reduction, large fuels reduction projects and habitat reduction projects, doing things that would actually help to protect cultural resources by reducing fuel well in advance of a wildfire. But the main thing is to recognize that no, you just can't go out and manage fires without talking to these folks. You do need to talk to them around a lot of these issues. And then also it's worth working with them to find ways to do pre-fire, do the activities that will help to protect resources like large fuels management projects. So I just want to put a plug in there and recognition the fact that there are roles for everybody in fire. All right, I jammed through that. So we're at the question period. I hope that this was comprehensive enough.
I think it was. There's already a question in the question answer section.
Okay.
It's isn't fire suppression foam, etc., bad for the lungs of the fire people and other creatures with lungs?
I cannot answer that. That's out of my level of expertise. I do know that there's a lot of concern about it when it comes to water resources. In fact, so much so that in some areas, such in the Southwest and New Mexico, because of the watersheds, they're not allowed to use it in certain watersheds. I have not heard anything about lungs, but again, that's not my area of expertise.
Another question, are there community groups that can help with the fires?
There are a couple of things that can happen. One is community groups. Yes, there are. This is what community groups can do. In fact, there are a lot of community groups who do this. Community groups can do things that implement to protect their communities from fire. So there are a lot of organizations and their grants and things available. Firewise is one of them I can think of off the top of my head, that certain communities in fire-prone areas can actually get resources to go in and actively do management activities around their communities to make their communities safer from wildfires. So that is what communities can do, is go in and work as a community and identify those areas where you have major concerns, major issues, major fuel, and take actions to try to reduce that, and get landowners to get rid of brush, and get landowners to do things, active things to protect their property. Because once the wildfire hits, that's just too late. You need to be thinking ahead.
This was a comment. Great presentation. Thank you. One of the steward sites is a wood trestle and culvert circa 1869 from the Transcontinental Railroad, which is bad news because, or okay news is, one of the old towns became more viewable after the vegetation was burned and many of the artifacts were actually found. There's a question. You said the finds are often exposed through a wildfire. Is there research into advanced work to protect sites beyond blanketing?
I'm sorry, what was that? Beyond what?
Blanketing?
I guess I don't understand the question. Say that again.
Is there research into advanced work to protect sites beyond blanketing? So putting a blanket. I think putting the covers over them.
Oh, you mean between putting a fire shelter over it?
Yeah,
other activities for protecting them? There's probably, and my guess, and I'm not in the know, but my guess is there are people who are trying to find other ways to do it. You know, part of this is we need to push research and development folks into valuing the need to do this and finding a way to do it in a way that's going to be cost effective. But you know, I don't know who's doing it, and I hope there are people who are doing it. But at this point, I don't know where that's being centered on. But nice thing about developing this Reed cohort and the archaeology cohort, we had all these people who were being trained as archaeologists who were working fires and had no way to communicate with each other. It wasn't until we actually started these cohorts and encouraged people, you know, have Zoom or a conference line number, because we've been doing this for a few years. So it started out with conference lines. Have conference line number, just send it out to a bunch of people and tell them to show up and give an opportunity to talk to each other. It's this collective knowledge and talking to each other. And part of the conversations around, hey, what innovative thing that you did? What worked for you? What didn't work for you? What did you guys figure out a new way that works better? That synergy of that collectiveness and that collective communication has really advanced the field. And I think that through that collective knowledge and communication, we're going to find new ways of getting at this. But is there someone who's focused on it? Not to my knowledge. Is there researchers, scientists who are focused on it? Not to my knowledge.
Okay, next question. Do you see increases in the site trespass and or looting when sites are exposed through wildfire? Do you have a rapid response teams for after the fire?
No. No. So when a team, what basically happens is when an incident management team wraps up a fire and they leave, everything is literally handed back to the agency. And then the responsibility for managing any effects or anything that happens after the incident management team leaves falls onto the agency. So that includes law enforcement. If these sites are exposed to looting because they've been exposed to fire, law enforcement knows this is an issue, but a lot of these agencies don't have a lot of law enforcement on staff. And so, you know, it helps for archaeologists if they have sites that they know they've been traditionally looted or know they're going to be very vulnerable, say sites that are right off roads, that type of stuff. It's good for the agency archaeologists should work with their law enforcement, identify these areas as places that could be vulnerable so that the law enforcement know where to put their energy. So those are things that you can do, but the reality of it is there are not enough law enforcement. So it's, you know, hopefully archaeologists, the agency archaeologists are taking the recommendations of the incident management team and the fire archaeologists and going out and actively monitoring these places, or get groups like yours involved, site stewards, to help go out and monitor these places that are vulnerable, is a way to do that. But it comes down to the agency archaeologists, and oftentimes they don't have enough people on staff to be able to really come up with a good, effective post-fire plan like that. So it's a real struggle for sure.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions they want to ask Margaret? Okay, well, I don't see any, so I want to say thank you to you for coming. We really appreciate it and learned a lot.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I loved hearing about it because I've heard bits and pieces, but it's good to know how it all fits together. So I'm very appreciative of that.
Oh, you're absolutely welcome. If any other questions come up, please let me know. I've offered to make this presentation available to you guys. Please take a look at the Fire Archaeology website. You can just Google Fire Archaeology and it'll come up. And if for those who are on Facebook, please take a look at the Facebook pages. There's a lot of great information in there if you get even more curious. So okay. I highly encourage it.
Well, thank you again, and have a wonderful weekend. And I'm sure you and I will chat in future as well.
All right. Well, take care, everyone. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.